Hello everyone, myself Vinay Kumaram. I'm actually pursuing PhD in physics. So in this particular YouTube channel, I'll be teaching physics, chemistry and mathematics starting from 8th standard till 12th standard. So if you want to learn physics, chemistry and mathematics, then please do subscribe to my channel. So in my previous videos and in this video, I'll be teaching the second chapter of 9th standard science subject, that is matter around a sphere. So in my previous videos, I have discussed various kinds of solutions, suspension, colloids, and also I have discussed the properties of all those things. So in this particular video, I'll be explaining what and all are the physical changes, chemical changes of a particular matter. And also we will discuss about the difference between element and a compound, and also we will discuss how mixture is different from a compound. So in the first chapter, you have learnt about melting point, boiling point, and also there will be rigidity for a particular matter, and also there will be certain amount of fluidity. Fluidity is the nature of a particular liquid. Also those particular liquid will be having their own melting point and boiling point. Any matter will be having certain amount of rigidity in it, and also matter will be having hardness. So how hard or how less hardness for a particular matter is there. These are all physical properties of a particular matter. So these are all known as physical properties of a particular matter. So these are all known as physical properties. So similar to physical properties, there are chemical properties to a matter as well. So how they actually react with another chemical compounds or elements, and what and all the chemical composition that particular matter is having will decide the chemical properties of that particular matter. So for example, let's say to understand how physical nature of a particular substance changes. So you might be knowing that ice is in the state of solid state and water is in the state of liquid state. So water is in liquid state. So water vapors will be in gaseous state. So here all these three have same chemical composition, that is H2O. Even ice contains the same chemical composition H2O. Even water contains the same chemical composition H2O. Even water vapor also contains the same chemical composition H2O. But ice is in the state of solid, water is in the state of liquid, water vapors are gas. So here you should see that the physical change happening to ice when it is converted into water. Even when water is converted into water vapor, then also there is a physical change. So solid state is changing to liquid state is changing to gaseous state. But the chemical composition which is there in this particular water, that is H2O, will never ever change. That means if ice is getting converted to water or water is converting to water vapor, at this particular process they never ever change the chemical composition. They remain same H2O. So the same H2O composition will be there in ice, water and water vapor. But there is change in physical state of these three. That is from solid to liquid, liquid to gaseous state. Similarly, there might be different chemical nature of different matters. So now let's take water and oil as example. So water is also a liquid and oil is also a liquid. So one common thing which is there in between water and oil is that both are in liquid state. But there is lot of chemical composition changes inside this particular water and oil. Density of water is more, but density of oil is less. And also oil is more flammable. So oil can be easily flammable in air. That is, it can easily catch fire and it can burn in air with fire. But water will actually extinguishes fire. So water has the capacity to extinguish fire, but oil has capacity to burn in air. That shows the chemical nature of oil is different and the chemical nature of water is different. Even though water and oil are in same liquid state, but because of different chemical nature, they will act differently. And also their rigidity, melting point, boiling point, all other physical properties are also different because of different chemical composition in these two liquids. So coming to the third case, when you actually burn a candle, here you can clearly see candle will be burning with fire, but this particular candle is in solid state, and this particular solid state candle is getting converted to gaseous state. So directly solid is converting into gaseous state, and this process is known as sublimation, which I have already explained in my previous videos. So here solid state is getting converted into gaseous state directly, and also there is a chemical change happening in this particular burning of candle, because when this particular candle is burning, there is a kind of chemical interaction between the composition which is there in that particular candle, and also the composition which is there in the candle is reacting with the oxygen molecules which are there in the atmosphere, and there is a kind of chemical reaction happening. So that shows even there is a chemical change happening, and also solid is getting converted into gaseous state. So even there is a physical change as well. So both physical change and chemical change can be seen when candle is burned. So this was all about physical and chemical changes of matter. Now let us move to the next concept in this particular chapter, that is elements. The name elements was first coined by the scientist named Robert Boyle. So in 1661, Robert Boyle was the first scientist who actually used this particular name element, and Antonio Laurent Lavoisier in 1743 to 1794 actually defined what is element. So he defined element as a basic form of matter that cannot be broken into simple substance. That means if you have an element, this cannot be broken into a simple substance. So let's say you have sodium, that is Na. So sodium is a basic element which you cannot divide into further simpler substance. So hydrogen is one kind of element, sodium is one kind of element, chlorine is one kind of element, potassium is one kind of element, phosphorus is one kind of element. So the individual chemical substance which cannot be broken further into another simpler substance, so that kind of substance was named as element. So now if you consider NaCl, NaCl is not an element because here sodium and chlorine both are there. So now you can split that NaCl into sodium and chlorine. That means they can further be splitted. But sodium cannot be further split into another simple substance. So sodium remains as an element, chlorine remains as an element, hydrogen remains as an element, potassium, phosphorus. So all the 118 chemical elements which you actually see in the periodic table, all those chemical substances are known as elements. So now what do you mean by compounds? So two or more elements combine together to form a different chemical substance. So there will be a chemical interaction between two or more elements. That particular chemical interaction between two or more elements will give rise to a new kind of substance, and that particular substance is known as compound. So let's say sodium and chlorine reacts together to form NaCl, and hydrogen and oxygen are reacting together to form H2O. So here to form water, two kinds of elements are mixing with each other in different composition. Here sodium and chlorine is also mixing in different composition to form sodium chloride, that is common salt. Here you should see that the composition of hydrogen is 2 and the composition of oxygen in this particular one compound, one molecule is 1. So there is 2:1 ratio of hydrogen and oxygen. Here 1:1 ratio is there for this particular sodium and chlorine. So this particular composition will be maintained throughout. That means there is a kind of chemical interaction between sodium and chlorine, and there is a kind of chemical interaction between hydrogen and oxygen in a different chemical composition. And this particular composition is fixed and it will be uniform throughout that. So that's why if hydrogen and oxygen is mixed together, then you will get water, and the composition of water throughout that water will be H2O only. That means the composition 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen is fixed throughout that particular water. So in a compound there will be a chemical interaction between two or more elements, and that particular chemical composition is fixed and it is maintained throughout. So that kind of substance is known as compound. Just mixture of two elements will not give you a compound. There should be a chemical interaction between those two or more than two elements which are combining together. So in elements you have three types. One is metals, the other is non-metals, and the third one is metalloids. So first we will look into the first kind of division, that is metals. So to understand what are all metals, we have to look into the properties of metals. So metals have shiny appearance. So this particular metals will always have a shiny appearance to it. And one important property of metal is that they can easily conduct heat and also they can easily conduct electricity. So heat conductivity will be there for these metals, and also electricity conductivity will also be there for this particular metals. So that means these metals can easily conduct electricity and also heat. So coming to the third property of metals, they are actually malleable. So what do you mean by malleable? They can be formed into sheet kind of thing. That means they can be hammered and they can be made into a desired shape. So that's why this kind of metals are malleable. So this is third property. And coming to the fourth property, metals are sonorous. So what do you mean by sonorous? Sonorous means a particular object which produces ringing sounds, which can produce ringing sounds when it is hit. So if you hit a particular metal, you will find a ringing sound is coming out of that particular metal. So that kind of property is known as sonorous property of a particular object, and metals are sonorous in nature. So this is fourth property of metal. So coming to the second division in this particular elements, they are non-metals. So non-metals are quite opposite to metals. So non-metals have wide variety of colors. So they have wide variety of colors because in metals they exhibit silvery gray or yellow, especially golden yellow. So this is the common color which you can find in metals. But in non-metals they exhibit wide variety of colors. So this is one particular property of non-metals. They are poor conductors of heat and electricity. They cannot easily conduct heat or electricity. So non-metals are poor conductors of heat and electricity. Whereas if you consider metals, their metals can easily conduct heat and electricity. So that's why metals are good conductors of heat and electricity, but non-metals are poor conductors of heat and electricity. So you can clearly see there is difference between metals and non-metals. So in exams they can ask a question where you have to differentiate between metals, non-metals and metalloids. So this kind of metal, non-metals are non-lustrous, non-sonorous and non-malleable. So they do not have lustrous nature. That means they do not have shiny appearance, and this particular non-metals are not sonorous in nature. That means when you hit this non-metals, you will not hear ringing sounds. So they are non-sonorous and non-malleable. They are not easily hammered. They cannot be easily hammered and convert into desired shape. So that's why they are non-malleable. So what are all the examples for metals? So example for metals are gold, silver, iron, sodium, potassium. So all these kind of elements are example for metal. So now what are all the examples for non-metals? So hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, bromine. So all these kind of chemical elements are example for non-metals. So coming to the third division in this particular elements, that is metalloids. So some elements can behave both as metals and non-metals. That means they have partial properties of metals. They exhibit partial properties of metal, and also they exhibit partial properties of non-metal. So such kind of elements are known as metalloids. So example for metalloids are boron is an example for metalloids, silicon is an example for metalloids, germanium is also an example for metalloids. So all these elements are example for metalloids. So that means they can easily exhibit partial properties of metals and also partial properties of non-metals. So now let us understand the difference between mixtures and what do you mean by compounds. So for this you can do an experiment in laboratories where you can take some iron fillings and you can actually mix this iron fillings with sulfur. So take some sulfur powder and take some iron fillings. These two, if these two chemical elements are mixed together, you will see some gas is actually getting evolved when you actually mix iron fillings and sulfur powder together. So there is no much chemical difference is happening between iron and sulfur. But there is a kind of mixture of iron and sulfur in this particular case. So iron can be represented by Fe and sulfur can be represented by S. So now if you mix iron fillings and sulfur powder and if you heat this particular mixture, then there will be a chemical reaction taking place between iron and sulfur. So there will be a chemical reaction taking place between this iron and sulfur when necessary amount of heat energy is provided for that particular mixture. Mixture of iron and sulfur was just iron and sulfur itself. So that's why when you mix iron and sulfur together, it will be known as mixture. But when you actually supply necessary amount of heat energy to this iron and sulfur mixture, at that particular time there will be a chemical reaction taking place between iron and sulfur. So just like when hydrogen and oxygen react with each other and forms H2O, that is water, that particular H2O chemical composition is maintained throughout that particular water. So that is actually a compound where there is fixed amount of chemical composition. But when you actually just mix two different elements and there is no chemical interaction between those two elements, then they are just known as mixtures. But when there is a chemical interaction and there is a fixed chemical composition between those two elements, then that particular composition can be known as compounds. So now let us see what are all the difference between mixtures and compounds. So in mixtures, elements or compounds will just mix with each other. So here two or more elements or compounds just mix with each other, just mix. There is no chemical reaction between those chemical compounds or elements which are mixed together. But here in compounds, there will be chemical reaction taking place between elements. So elements react with each other and form new compounds. So here two or more elements are mixed together and this particular elements will react with each other and they will give rise to a new compound. So that's why that is known as compounds. Here in mixture, elements are just mixed, there is no chemical interaction between these elements, hence they will be just known as mixtures. But when there is a chemical reaction between those elements, then they will form a compound. So coming to the second difference, here there is no fixed composition. No fixed composition is there. That means you can mix any two elements in whatever composition you want. But here in the formation of compounds, there will be uniform composition throughout the compound. So there will be uniform fixed composition throughout this particular compound. So let's say you are mixing hydrogen and oxygen and oxygen are reacting with each other and they are forming water, that is H2O. So that particular H2O is only maintained throughout the water. But here if you are mixing two different elements of different nature where they cannot have a chemical interaction with each other, at that particular time they just form a mixture and they can be in any kind of composition. There is no fixed composition. But when you are actually forming a new compound, at that particular time two elements will form a fixed composition with each other. That is, two hydrogen molecules and one oxygen molecules will interact with each other to form water molecule. That means there is a fixed chemical composition between two elements or two or more elements. But in mixtures, there is no fixed composition. They can have any kind of ratio because they are not forming any kind of new compound. They are just forming a mixture. So this is actually difference between mixture and compounds. So coming to the third difference, mixtures show same property. Mixtures show same property of constituent substance. So that means whatever the initial elements you are mixing together, initial compounds you are mixing together and forming a mixture, so whatever the chemical nature of that initial elements or compounds was there, that particular chemical nature will be there for this mixture as well. But in compounds, when you actually mix two or more elements together, then there is a formation of new compound, and this particular new compound will have different property of its constituent substance. If you take water as example, hydrogen has different property, oxygen has different property. But when hydrogen and oxygen come together to form H2O molecule, water molecule, that particular water molecule itself has different chemical properties compared to hydrogen and oxygen. So that shows a new compound which is getting formed by different elements will have different properties compared to the elements which that particular compound is actually using to form a compound. But in mixtures, there is no chemical interaction between elements itself. So that's why the chemical nature of mixture will be more or less the same as the chemical properties which are there with the initial elements and compounds which are mixed together. So here, mixtures can be separated by physical methods. So mixtures can be separated by physical methods. So how you can actually separate mixtures? So let's say NaCl is one kind of compound and water is another kind of compound. So you are forming mixture between NaCl and water. That is, you are mixing salt in water. So at that particular time, how you will remove salt from water? If you actually evaporate, if you actually boil that particular water, all water molecules will be evaporated and salt will be remaining in that particular container itself. So this is actually a physical method through which you are actually separating salt and water. But in chemical compound, if you want to separate chemical compound, let's suppose say if you want to separate water itself, that is if you want to separate hydrogen and oxygen itself. So if you want to split hydrogen and oxygen itself in water molecule, that is in H2O molecule, then you cannot actually use physical methods. You should use some chemical methods to split this particular water. Or any kind of chemical compounds, if you want to split into their individual elements, then you should use some chemical methods or some kind of chemical reaction should be performed so that you can actually split that particular compound. But in mixtures, you can easily separate mixtures through some physical methods. So let's say you are mixing some iron fillings, that is some metals with some non-metal elements. So at that particular time, you can use a magnet and you can actually separate metals from non-metals. So that means you are actually separating two different elements by a physical method where metals are mixed with non-metals. But if they are forming compound with each other, at that particular time you should use some other chemical methods more than physical methods to separate that particular elements which has formed a chemical compound. So I have covered this particular chapter in 4 videos. So go through all these 4 videos to understand this second chapter of 9th standard science subject. So like this, if you want to learn more physics, chemistry and mathematics starting from 8th standard till 12th standard, then you have to subscribe to my channel. Please do subscribe to my channel and stay tuned with my channel. Thank you.